carried. All right, well, we have an active meeting, so why don't we dive in? Good morning. Welcome to the Mitigation Working Group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. I'm Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager at MDE. We are recording this meeting. All of our meetings for the Climate Commission are posted to the Climate Commission's YouTube channel. The agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We'll start with opening remarks from the MWG co-chairs, go to public comments if there are any. If there are any public commenters, feel free to put your name in the chat, and that'll create a list that we can use to call on people for public comment. And then we will be reviewing the final few recommendations that have not yet been voted on by the MWG. We'll first entertain amendments to those recommendations and then move one by one to voting on them to advance or not advance to the Climate Commission for its consideration for inclusion in the 2024 annual report. Before turning to the co-chairs, are there any people who are standing in for MWG members today, or any members who are calling in on the phone? All right, hearing none. Kim, Mike, good morning, and would you like to make any opening remarks?
Good morning. I don't have any opening remarks.
I'll just add quickly, want to thank you for everyone for participating in these. We do appreciate that. We did have a little problem last time that in recording votes, just to remind people that only members of the work group here can actually vote at this time. And just a reminder that in addition to public comment and input here, these recommendations will go to the Climate Change Commission, and you'll have another chance to comment and make your views known at that time. And we certainly welcome that process. Mark?
Great, thanks. I don't see, Jana, good seeing you this morning. Was there anyone who'd like to make a public comment before we dive into today's business? Okay, seeing none, we will pick up where we left off last time, which is discussing amendments to draft recommendations. And let me share screen so we're all looking at the same thing. I'm happy to say that there was some behind the scenes work done by several MWG members since our last meeting to discuss and refine, streamline a couple of pieces where we had several members had introduced similar amendments to parts of the recommendations. Those members talked in the week and a half since our last MWG meeting and worked up a revised version of those amendments. So it's a much more streamlined approach now to review just a singular amendment instead of competing amendments to certain sections. Why don't we just take it from the top? We can start today at item 1A. This was a recommendation from Kim Coble, and Kim, you had also introduced some amendments to your recommendation, so perhaps we start there. Going down the list here. So the first, sorry, let me adjust the screen size a bit. So we received some amendments to 1A from both the author of the recommendation and I think at least 2 or 3 members. So we'll start with amendments from the author. Kim, do you want to discuss your amendments?
Sure, although I can't remember exactly which ones I submitted. I do know that so this is a cap and invest, creating a cap and invest program, authorizing MDE to create one. And one of the things that we are recommending is to be explicit about where the money would go. And so you can see the bullets there. And there's, under electric vehicles, we did add that some of the funding could go to transit, which is an important aspect of clean transportation. And the other was that we adjusted the natural working lands program administration went up to 9%, and we added the public awareness campaign, which was a recommendation from the education group. So, and we support, or I support anyway. So those are some of the changes that I've added. It's hard to tell which ones. Yeah. And then the carbon dividends were to provide income to low income, moderate households. So that's an explicit addition too. So I think those were primarily mine. Most of the other ones I think came from Mike.
Yeah, and kind of conveniently, we can see, I think, all of your amendments, Kim, here on the screen.
Right. Yeah, it had to do with the funding allocations. Yeah.
Yeah. So so maybe we start there. And is there a second to Kim's amendment?
I'll second her amendment.
Okay. Thank you. So we have seconded. Is there any opposition following, unless Kim, Mike, you indicate otherwise, following the procedure the last meeting to ask if there's any opposition, and if not, we can accept amendments to a recommendation.
That's fine with me.
Okay. I see a hand from Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, this is not opposition. I just wanted to, well, Kim, first of all, thanks for incorporating the carbon dividends piece. That was something we suggested. I appreciate that. The one question I had is whether the language at the very top of the screen, that new language in that paragraph starting the General Assembly should direct, arguably covers carbon dividends. Basically what it says is that after carbon dividends that hold low and moderate income households harmless are paid, then the remaining money should be divided among these additional buckets. And I wonder if it would be a little more economical to say that the General Assembly should direct a sufficient portion of the revenue toward rebates or carbon dividends for low and moderate income households, sufficient to eliminate net cost increases. I think if you did that, you might be able to cut the carbon dividends bullet as redundant. Does that make sense?
So you're talking about the top paragraph there on the screen.
Right.
Yes.
Because
yes,
both,
I see what, yeah, thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
That
because both the new language in that introductory paragraph and the first bullet describing the carbon dividends
Right.
basically go to the same point.
same thing.
So I don't know
Right.
that you need both. I think as long as you capture the concept somewhere and that the recommendation stands for the proposition that we should hold those households harmless before making these other expenditures. I think that's OPC's concern.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Kim, do you want to take some comments?
Yeah,
on
but
that?
hang on, Jennifer. I guess my only so the term sufficient portion of the revenue. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, I got it. Thank you. So we would delete the first bullet and add the phrase carbon dividends in the upper paragraph.
Yeah,
That's-
I would board rebates or carbon dividends. And then I think, I think you could eliminate the first paragraph. Then.
Yep. Okay. The first bullet.
First bullet. Thank you.
I think that's right.
Okay. Thank you.
You'll have the same effect, but it's confusing otherwise.
Right.
Okay, so it sounds like, Kim, you're willing to
yeah.
accept that in your suggested amendments, which would mean removing that as well. Okay, so then why don't we, there were a couple hands up, so we can go to any comments on these amendment changes. Jennifer?
Yes, I guess I wasn't clear that so much of the money would then go to these rebates to low and moderate income households. So I didn't really understand how much would be left for all those other priorities. So I just wondered if that could be a little clarified for me.
Yeah, and that's addressed in Resources for the Future in their report. They addressed how this is typically handled in other jurisdictions that have economy-wide cap and invest programs. And I actually think that I saw, looking down my attendee list, do we have someone from RFF here? Because I see Mark Halfstead is here. That's great. Before I get this number wrong, Mark, if you're willing to chime in, is it typically around a third or a quarter of revenue that we see in other jurisdictions directed toward these sort of dividends or rebates, and then the remainder is then used for strategic climate investments?
I think that's about right. California does it through, they give like allowances to utilities who are then directed to use that to lower bills. So that's kind of how they do it. New York's proposal is to do rebates to households. I think it's about 30%, so right around a third.
So in fairness, I mean, the way it's worded, it'll be a variable amount because it's whatever you need to offset, right? So it could be smaller or more, depending on what the increases are.
If you tried, I mean, from a modeling perspective, or like, we could, you can try to estimate, changes to the program will change how much you need to offset the, offset the costs. But I think from writing a bill perspective, you pretty much have to choose an amount and think that you're close. So it's kind of hard to write a bill that allows you to change the amount that you're going to allocate in any given thing. You'd have to come up with some kind of some kind of formula that might be very difficult. So I think normally the way that people do it is they do some ex ante estimates and then kind of evaluate as you go.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.
Bob Wright, did you have a question as well?
Excuse me. Yes. Although you removed the bullet, which I think is helpful, it seems to me we have a mix here of some areas have no amount. So you just discussed what it might be. And I guess, just to clarify for me, that whatever's left after that amount, this will now, it will be distributed. Because in one sense, you're very specific about how much you want to go in percentage, but in the top part, you're not. So we don't really, at least in my opinion, it's cap and invest, and I'm supportive of this, and I think there ought to be carbon dividends, but I just feel uncomfortable about, in some cases, not talking about how much, and in other cases being very specific. To me, it's confusing. So I've said my piece.
Thanks, Bob. And you're right. I think that the language here allows that an indeterminate amount would be applied to make whole the low-income households and covering any energy price impacts of a cap and invest program. And then the remaining percentages are specific in terms of how the remaining revenue to the state would be allocated for these strategic investments. So confirming your read of the recommendation. And a parallel sort of here is, of course, how the state utilizes revenues generated through the RGGI program, where a significant portion of that is allocated to electricity bill assistance, primarily benefiting, of course, low-income households that apply for bill assistance. And then the remainder is then used for strategic energy investments. Is there any further discussion on Kim's amendments? Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, just in case it'd be helpful for everyone, an example of how this would potentially be implemented if it were on our desk right now. As Mark said, you would want to do sort of an ex ante analysis of what sufficient is in this case to determine the percentage. And you all may recall that RFF's analysis did include that for specific sectors. You may recall that for some of the sectors, the portion of proceeds sufficient to keep the first 2 quintiles whole, which is the 40% of the income distribution, roughly corresponds to the state's existing definition of low to moderate income. It varied sector by sector between about 27 and 30% of proceeds from a particular sector being sufficient to fully cover cost increases to those households.
Chris? Tom Ballantyne?
So I was going to point out that 30% target in the research, but the Rewiring America work that was done for the implementation task force put the low and moderate income household number at 1.3 million, leaves about a little over 400,000 households that are in the higher income category. That's a substantial amount of money reinvested, and I think it, as a compassionate and a kind of a fiscal reality at the household level, it's something that absolutely should be considered. When you look down this list, there's a lot of money going to things that won't necessarily be reducing emissions. I'm wondering what the yield is at the end of the day.
That's an excellent question.
Yeah, Mike.
Just a comment. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. The amendments I have call for authorizing the setup of the program, but not yet implementation. So it would come back to us once some of these details are worked out. And we haven't gotten to my amendment yet, but I'll just mention that.
Got it. I'm thinking about your comment. I mean, it seems that of course, program administration doesn't necessarily achieve emission reductions. It does seem that the other investment categories here are intended to reduce emissions or enhance carbon sequestration activities.
Sequestration doesn't count towards 2031. Program administration is one category. The infrastructure may or may not reduce emissions by 2031, depending on how fast that money can be redeployed. It's good to carve out some things for buildings, but it's going to be a slow go there. So I think it's a legitimate question about what you have left at the end of the day, and who's how much proportionate share are different sectors of the economy carrying here.
I got it. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And a reminder for everyone in terms of the modeling that was done, the MDE did not, and our consultants did not find a pathway to achieving the 60 by 31 goal, nor the net zero by 2045 goal without including cap and invest in the model. So part of these investments, I think, which we called for in the climate plan, are aligned with the idea of the investments that are also needed to achieve net zero emissions economy-wide by 2045. Is there further discussion on the amendments that you see on the screen from the author of the recommendation. Is there any objection to accepting the amendments on the screen? Yeah, Tom. Tom, you're raising your hand for objecting to the amendments.
Look, it makes a big difference to me whether Michael Powell's amendment passes or not. And if we're studying the reallocation and the percentages, and I think that's a different question to me than directing MDE to do this today.
Got it. Okay, and we'll get to Mike's amendments very soon. But it sounds like we'll set up a hands up, hands down vote on accepting the Kim Coble amendments to recommendation 1A as you see on the screen. Just confirming that everything we see on the screen is from Kim, and I think that it is. So using the hand raise feature as we did last meeting, please put your hand up if you approve the amendments as seen on the screen. We got a hand clap from Sonia. Thank you.
Sorry, wrong button.
Yeah, that is your okay, there we go. All right, just confirming that we've got members that are voting. Thank you. I see 18 in favor. Thank you. You can put your hands down. Any opposed to these amendments? I see 2 opposed. Thank you. You can lower your hands. Anyone abstaining from voting on these amendments? Okay, seeing no abstentions, we will accept these. And then we'll go to natural working lands was meant to be 10, sorry. So Mark had some amendments that that Kim indicated were friendly amendments, some clarifications to the preamble leading into this. So Mark, would you like to describe your amendments to the top part of the recommendation?
Sure. Yeah, these are friendly amendments. I think they're really more stylistic than anything else. I thought it's important that the word revenue appear, which it didn't before, and just sort of slightly tweaked the way that equity is being framed. But I don't think these change the substance of the preamble at all.
Thank you. And okay, so we'll take this just in this first section. These were effectively seconded by Kim, indicating that she sees these as friendly. Any opposition to accepting these changes to the preamble? Hearing no opposition, we will accept those changes. All right, and then I think Mark, you maybe had a few other, I think, clarifications. So do you want to continue?
Sure. Yeah, these again, I consider more wordsmithing than anything else in friendly amendments. I think the one arguably substantive amendment is striking of the phrase, "The state has no path to achieve its climate goals without cap and investor or similar policy." I'm always nervous with language that that is that absolute that implies that there's no possible alternative. We may not have been able to identify any, and there may not be any, but I don't think it hurts just to say that we know that based on the modeling, a cap and invest program can achieve these ends. So just a slight difference in tone. I don't consider that really substantive. Open to hear other, people's views, but everything else is I think purely stylistic.
Alrighty, so what we have in this paragraph, we have the very first suggested change is from Mike Powell. So why don't we consider the Mark Sibbitt's amendments, which are all that follow the first one. So starting with this strike through, is there anyone who would second the Mark's amendments to?
I'll second him, Mark.
All right, thanks. That's a second. Is there anyone opposed to these amendments? I hear no opposition. So we'll move to accept these amendments. And let's see if, so then we've got Mike. Oh, you've got one in here from Brian McGowan. Brian, do you want to describe your amendment to this next paragraph?
Honestly, I don't. Yeah, so this is just meant to clarify that this is supplemental to Reggie, that this doesn't replace Reggie. So just clarifying that particular point.
Great, thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
All right, that's seconded. Any opposition? Hearing no opposition, we'll accept that line change. Thank you. All right, and then Mark, coming back to you, a couple more word changes, a few more word changes in this paragraph. I think these are pretty self-explanatory. Anything you'd like to describe about these few word changes in here?
No, again, probably too nitpicky. I don't think they changed the substance at all. Sorry about that.
No problem. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right. Any opposition to accepting these changes? Hearing none. This is what we get for having attorneys on this working group. Always experts at the English language. Thank you, Mark. All right, which might bring us to Mike's amendments. Yes, okay. So Mike, coming back up to the top of 1A, would you like to describe your amendments?
Sure, you might want to, they're basically a set. The purpose is to authorize MDE to begin to set up this program, design it, answer all of the detailed questions that we'd have, figure out how much money we actually going to get, how much goes to support the offsets, confirm that we're not going to be duplicating anything from Reggie. What is the impact on the cost of gasoline? What is the impact on the economy? Can Maryland afford this $1 billion when we're facing a big structural deficit? But allows the department to proceed with the setting up process, which is going to take a year or two anyway. Allows us to find out whether the Washington program, which ours seems to be based primarily on, gets repealed in November because it's on the ballot. And last I checked, the polling indicated that it was more likely to be repealed than affirmed. All of those questions, it seemed to me, we need to answer before we say implement a $1 billion impact. And I'm certainly, as one of the business representatives on this group and the only business representative at the moment on the commission, aware of all the letters that we've received from business groups, very concerned about the impact on the state's economy of this $1 billion charge. So my compromise is, let's authorize the program to be set up. Let's authorize the department to get us answers to these detailed issues. But let's come back for another vote once those answers are provided, once we have a working model of what the program will say, and then be able to vote whether to implement it. I have to emphasize, this is a very important issue to me. I feel like I cannot vote to support this process with these kind of questions unanswered. So if my amendments are not voted on, then at least personally, my vote would be against the program. So obviously one vote may not be definitive, but I am asking people to very seriously consider this, that allows the program to advance without committing us at this point to $1 billion impact before a lot of these details are worked out.
Great, thanks. And I can't show them all together, so just touching, this is the first piece would suggest that we explore following and not direct us to follow the other states on this. Develop but not yet implement, as Mike stated. This additional line in the middle here that you can see on the screen, requiring the development of a program proposal to go to the Climate Commission, presumably next year. There's no date attached to that. And then the final piece is being essentially the requirement for MDE to adopt regulations to begin the program in 2027. And one implication, of course, is the timing. So the original recommendation from Kim would have MDE doing a reporting rule in 2025, legislation in 2025, a full rule from MDE in 2026, which would allow a program to start in 2027 and investments to start in 2028. I think the impact of Mike's amendment bumps that back by 1 year, depending on the requirements of the plan that would be, or the report that would be delivered to the Climate Commission. But my read on that was it's a reporting rule still in 25. I guess a 2025 report, Mike, to the Climate Commission.
I don't think you have to delay the reporting portion, because it's the cap and invest that I'm intended to address. So you could still do the reporting in 2025.
Right. But the program design delivery to the Climate Commission, presumably next year, which would at the earliest give it 2026 legislation, 27 rule, 28 start date, with 2029 first possible year of investment. So anyhow, the effect, I think, would be moving the year by which money would begin flowing from 28 to 29. So just as
assuming that the General Assembly does adopt it this year, which I think is highly unlikely.
So I see a hand from Ian.
Thanks, Mark. One question, Mike. I know that there may be some who there may be disagreement about the agency's authority to do this without explicit legislative direction, right? I recognize that. But I guess simply setting up or working on the program is a little different from actually imposing it without legislative approval. At least I'd argue that. Maybe that also is subject to disagreement. So I guess my question is it necessary for the legislature, in your view, to direct or authorize MDE to begin developing a program that would still have to come back for subsequent enactment by the General Assembly, as opposed to the commission saying to MDE, we recommend that you proceed on developing this program, and then people can disagree about what happens after that, or we could say it here to the extent that there's a vote on that.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think,
yeah.
sorry.
No.
I think it probably depends on the details. I think there are a lot of things, for example, the reporting requirements that MDE may, and I'd need to do some research on it, but may have the authority to do. Some parts of it, such as collecting money, they clearly don't, I don't think. So it depends on the detail. My concern was that this is drafted as a General Assembly should pass legislation and MDE shall do this. And so my problem with that is I'm not prepared at this time to endorse that kind of blanket approval. I do not have a problem with beginning to develop the program and answer some of these questions, including what is the fiscal impacts of particular industries and a more complex analysis. But I have a problem with just as it's drafted, directing that or recommending the legislature adopt one and directing the department to take certain steps.
So let me just, I know Kim and others want to get in. Let me is there a way, do you think, that the department could proceed with developing the program and then still get legislative authorization to actually implement it without delaying the process? Because that has obviously implications for meeting our climate goals.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything in law that would stop the department from developing a program, right? There are pieces of it where, you know, if I can imagine in their development, if they're requiring people to do certain things, then you have to look at what those certain things are. But there's nothing to stop the department internally from developing, unless it's budget issues. There's nothing to stop the department internally from developing the program, filling in the details, and presenting it to the legislature for approval. At the point where they need to get businesses or citizens to comply.
What about the reporting, though, that the department, I think, would probably need in order to, develop the program?
Perhaps. I mean, the thing about reporting is it gets into that question of CO2 a pollutant, and do they have the authority to require people to report emissions of pollutants, right? A lot of what you may want, I think they probably have the authority to. Again, the devil's in the details, so I'd have to look at it. But and I don't particularly have a problem, just speaking for myself, with something that authorized the department to require reporting. I just have a problem with authorizing the department to implement a cap and invest $1 billion program at this time.
Thanks.
Quick programming note, we jumped into the discussion of these amendments. Tom Valentine essentially seconded them earlier, but I'm playing a little loosey-goosey with Robert's rules. So feel free to tell me, Tom, whether we should accept your second on these while we continue.
On Michael's amendment?
Yes, on Michael's.
Sure. Yeah, I second Michael's amendment.
Yeah, thank you. All right, continuing discussion and going to Kim.
Thanks. I've got a couple comments, but I'm just going to ask this one question first. So there's a requirement that the Maryland Commission on Climate Change would approve this program. And I don't think that's our purview. And I don't even know how we would ever go about that. So maybe, I don't know if that question is for Chris or Mike, but
by approve, I meant that they come back to the commission, and I would suggest the mitigation working group, though it only requires the commission, and say, okay, here's the detail. We need you to vote again to say you're now recommending we implement. So in other words, we would be voting now to develop the program, and it'd be a second vote to implement. Recommend implementation, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, that is a completely different role than we've ever played. We have never, so if the mitigation work group or the Commission on Climate Change doesn't approve MDE's program, does that mean it doesn't move forward? I mean, that's a ton of.
You maybe it needs to be more artfully written. What I meant is that it comes back for for us to recommend adoption or not recommend adoption. It's not an up or down vote. It's whether it's an up or down whether we
But
recommend.
again, that's putting the commission in a role to almost be a regulatory body. I mean, we would then have, so the state cannot move forward unless the mitigation work group
No.
approves it.
No, it's not what I intended. What I intended is they come back and we make a new recommendation. But we do, but my language does say that the General Assembly, we recommend that the General Assembly has to have a vote on it after it's developed.
Right, which I also oppose. But I would want, I don't know. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that language there and what the implications are to the commission?
Yeah,
That
I
really
see.
bothers me.
Yeah, I see the issue here. Of course, the commission is an advisory body. It doesn't have authority over regulations or anything like that. There are existing bodies, MDE, we have to bring every air regulation to an advisory committee established under law. And then, of course, every regulation goes to a joint committee in the legislature, AELR. So the Climate Commission does not have a formal role in that. So, yeah, certainly we'd want to avoid turning the Climate Commission into a body that has that kind of authority.
You can take the word approval out and just say to the Climate Change Commission for their recommendation. Because that's really what I mean, is that let the commission take a vote on whether to recommend it or not.
And what are the implications of that if the
commission, well, the
doesn't make the recommendation?
The General Assembly can approve it or not, whether the commission recommends it or not. But the Climate Change Commission would not be on record now as recommending implementation until they see the details. Then they'd either recommend, yes, we think you should go, or recommend that you don't. The General Assembly is free to ignore either recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Bob Bright.
Yes, I support this in the sense that eventually there's a recommendation to the legislature. I think that one has a better chance of having it approved if you have more details than what I see here. So my comment would be that I think you stand a better chance of having the legislature do something if you can provide them with greater details. And having the program developed and understanding all the questions that we've asked will provide those details. So I certainly support this.
Thanks, Bob. Mark?
Thanks, Mark. Mike, I had two questions. One is whether there's any additional analysis that you think should be done in order to generate the information that's needed to provide the additional detail in the program. And two, and this sort of goes to Bob's point. I was actually thinking the opposite of Bob, that if the goal of this process is to develop a sort of full-fledged regulation with all the details worked out, I don't know that the General Assembly would be more willing to accept that, because it would give them very little discretion and flexibility. I mean, obviously they could change anything, but they would not have any role to sort of create something. And maybe that would be to their liking, and maybe not. I'm not sure, though, that it would make it more likely to be embraced. But I guess the question I had was mostly whether there's any additional analysis that you think should be performed to generate the additional detail.
Yeah, in my opinion, yeah. I mean, as an example, I've seen widely varying estimates of how much this is going to add to the cost of a gallon of gasoline. People are trying to make a comparison to the situation and what the price increases were in Washington State. I'm not sure whether those numbers are applicable here. I don't know whether either the high numbers or low numbers I've heard are the same. But obviously, if we're talking about let me pick some of the numbers I've heard, 25 to 32 cent increase in the price of gasoline has severe economic impacts on the Maryland economy, particularly if none of our neighboring states are doing it. I don't know how much we're going to need to provide to low-income residents under the existing language before we have allocate the remaining money to climate programs, because I don't know how much the cost of increase in electricity resulting from the programs are going to be, because we don't know in detail what the programs are going to be. I think there's a lot of unknown questions that we could get answers to over the next year. And I'm just not prepared to endorse a program before I know the results of that analysis. I mean, just one last comment. We don't even know what the impact will this be on the revenues of state and local governments, right? We know that the state's got this huge budget deficit, but the state buys gasoline. The state has to comply with these climate programs. The counties have to comply with these county programs. The municipalities have to comply with these climate programs. I haven't seen a good detailed analysis of what the impacts will be on government revenues and government expenses. So those are the kinds of things I'd like to see answers to.
Mike, Tom?
Thanks, Mark. Look, I agree with what Michael has said here in terms of additional information that will be helpful. But from my point of view, when there's a suggestion made that this is like RGGI, I think only in a superficial way, unless we know more, because RGGI is a multi-state program. It removes 2% of the allocations per year, give or take. Washington State's removing 7%, and they don't have as steep a target as we do. This is designed to stack on top of other programs, including BEPS, and I'd like to understand how it interacts with other planned mitigation programs and regulations. And to me, we were more supportive of the Transportation Climate Initiative than other business groups, because it was a multi-state long-term program. These kinds of tax and invest or cap and invest approaches are not 6-year approaches. If you calibrate it to 60 by 31, you're going to put the public between a hammer and the anvil, and they may not have the ability to take the price signal and pivot out of their fossil fuel use. There's to me, some contradiction in the documentation for the methodology and the modeling. In the tables, it says that electric generation is exempt, but in the narrative, it credits this program with closing in-state gas-fired power plants. I'd like to understand more about what we're setting in motion here.
Garrett?
I mostly wanted to ask, I thought Ian asked some really important questions all the way back at the beginning of this, and I think it's very, very important that we get started and get started robustly here. I don't love the idea of this having to go to the General Assembly multiple times. I think a version of this needs to be able to move, and it's useful to design the process in a way where that can happen. So I'm kind of curious to hear MDE's answers to the questions that Ian was asking, mostly Mike, I think, in the beginning, around what is the department able to do under its own authority if the General Assembly didn't take action on this now? Should we even end up preferring asking the General Assembly only to take action the following year after MDE does a bunch of things that it can do now, or do we indeed need this to go forward to the General Assembly this year for MDE to be able to do the pieces that would kind of get us on a time frame that will get us somewhere here? I guess it's mostly for Chris, who's next in the queue. So
Exactly what I was going to say. Wonderful timing, Garrett, and good timing anticipating those questions, Chris.
Well, I'm not an assistant attorney general. If I were, I wouldn't give advice of counsel on a public meeting. I think it's the recommendation envisions that MDE can do a reporting rule. I think that's really pretty clear. And Mike suggested some of the legal questions earlier, where greenhouse gases are air pollutants under state law, and the requirement and the department can generally require that air pollution be reported. In terms of I guess, the process, and maybe speaking to a lot of the questions that we heard about what would be the impacts are the kinds of things that we're required to estimate during a regulatory process, right? Our rulemaking packages have lengthy analysis of costs and benefits, consider different ways and for different groups, and there's sort of continued public and legislative oversight throughout the process before and after those estimates are produced, I guess. So I think, I'm not a voting member of the working group, so I can't say whether this thing goes forward or not. But if we were implementing this, again, we would be embarking on a lengthy regulatory process to explore the specific parameters of the program, what those specific parameters mean through stakeholdering before we have a draft regulation, through stakeholdering and formal comment and analysis of a draft regulation that goes to the public and to the legislature. So I think that it would certainly not be, if we had the answer of the exact parameters of any given regulatory program before we even started the regulatory process, I'm not sure that's ever been the case. There is always a process to develop the specific parameters, quantify them, explore their impacts, and get everyone's input on those. And of course, there's oversight all along the way, as we saw earlier this year with one high-profile regulatory program with the legislature, after receiving all of that analysis, told us to make some changes, and we did. So, I think my take on this personally is that we've been analyzing this policy mechanism specifically and the climate strategy more generally for years. We've been rewriting the climate plan every couple of years since I was in high school. I guess my personal input is it's time for the state to stop studying and act across the board, understanding that action itself requires a whole lot of studying more as you go, years of analytical work before a regulatory program like this would be in effect.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Brian?
Yeah, I'll just sort of maybe second Chris's point on avoiding further delay. Broadly, these types of programs, Cap and Invest, are the most efficient way to reduce emissions on a dollar per ton basis. The state has its statutory obligations, and if this is, again, broadly, one of the most efficient ways to meet those obligations, I think we have a duty to proceed. So as a voting member of the working group, I would recommend that we not further delay when we know that there'll be ample opportunity to study and discuss and assess the potential impacts on various constituencies within the state.
Thanks, Brian. We're joined by Climate Commission member David Smedick. David, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Mike, Chris, Kim, everybody that's been chiming in on this. So yes, I'm not a voting member of the mitigation working group, but I am of the full commission. And so just, I think, a clarifying question for me, based on the way that Chris was just explaining the process. I'm trying to understand if Mike and Tom, some of the recommendations within these proposed amendments, are you seeking more like process, more legislative input than what the current regulatory process that Chris just detailed would be? Like, are we looking for more than AELR? Are your amendments recommending more than AELR input and process in that, or am I mistaken?
No, I think the way I would word it is that I am not prepared to vote to implement this program until I know the answers to more details. It's simply that. It's not that I think they have to do more analysis, they have to do more than ALR or any of these, but I don't want to sign what I think is largely a blank check, and a check that's $1 billion. I understand what Chris is saying, that we've been working on this thing for a long time. This is the first time I've been asked to vote on a $1 billion revenue raising action. I can't even think of anything that the General Assembly has voted on. That's $1 billion before they knew all the fiscal analysis of it. So what I'm saying is I'm not prepared today to say that we should do this. And after we've got some more detail, I might see what my recommendation would be, but I can't at this time.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. I'll step back. I think I got the info I needed so far. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Mike. Going to Tom.
Just to the assertion that this kind of mechanism is one of the most efficient ways of mitigating climate impacts. I think under certain circumstances it can be, but this is not the cap and invest that the Nobel laureates signed on to. Theirs was a replacement for prescriptive regulatory requirements. This one is stacked on top of them. And that interaction really concerns me. And I think, there is a role, Reggie has worked well, but it's been kind of running silently in the background for a long time. And there's really no indication to me that this policy calibrated to 60 by 31 is going to run quietly in the background or even have a minor impact on households and businesses. And I'd like to see more before being asked to endorse it.
Kim?
Thanks, everybody. I think it's a really good discussion. I think it's really important. I also want to probably pull up to the 10,000 foot level here because Mark, maybe scroll up, if you don't mind, to keep going. Okay, right there. So this recommendation is to adopt a climate investment strategy, right? It should pass legislation to authorize the development of at least 3 investment mechanisms. And I put forward 3 different mechanisms. And we cannot achieve our goals or even move in the direction of achieving our goals without more revenue. That was very clear from the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan. Kathleen Kennedy's on this call, can answer any questions on that. And so I still believe we have to move forward finding revenue. The other thing here is that, Mike and Tom have very clearly put out the comments about the potential economic impact on businesses, on households, etc. There is the other side of the equation that we never talk about. And I think in the report, it might be 165 million or something of impacts to infrastructure, to health outcomes, to community, to local governments. And so this isn't just, oh my gosh, it might cause a gallon of gas to go up a little bit. This is also, oh my gosh, how do we help reduce the costs on the public health sector? And so again, at this 10,000 foot level, I don't have all the answers. And I cannot tell you exactly what this cap and invest program is. I can tell you that delaying action on moving forward with revenue is simply kicking the can down the road. And that's all it is. We're just kicking the can down the road. And therefore, I'm going to oppose the suggested amendments.
Just a note that we're at the top of the hour and haven't yet voted on our first recommendation of the day. So we might look to close the conversation on the proposed amendments. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, just one comment, just so that there's no confusion on my position. I agree that climate change will have huge health impacts, but I think we have to be careful to think that one action by, or even the entire climate change plan of Maryland will avoid those health impacts. We have to recognize that we have a lever, but it's a very small lever. And my concern is that the major advantage of our program is to set an example for other states. If we do something wrong and it causes a huge economic problem, we've set a bad example. And that's why I think we have to move cautiously and judiciously as we proceed.
there any further discussion on Mike's amendments to 1A? Hearing none, I suggest we move to a vote, and I'll review again the amendments because they're sort of spread out, so I won't be able to show it all on the screen all at the same time. So Maryland should explore following rather than follow the lead of California, New York, and Washington in developing an economy-wide cap and invest program. MDE should develop but not yet implement a program. Once the program is developed and details determined, MDE should present the draft program to the Maryland Commission on Climate Change for its recommendation and subsequent submittal to the General Assembly. And then finally, striking some references to the reports that were reviewed by the MWG and the requirement that legislation should require MDE to adopt regulations in 26 and begin enforcing cap and invest in 2027. So we'll move those amendments to a vote. The first vote will be voting in favor of the amendments to accept those amendments into the recommendation. Using the hand raise feature, thank you. Please vote if you're accepting those amendments. Thank you. I see 8 in favor of accepting the amendments. You can put your hands down. All right, all in favor of rejecting the amendments, please hands up. It's a close vote, but there are 11 in favor of rejecting, which slightly tops the 8 in favor of accepting. So those amendments will come down. I'm sorry, and a quick abstention vote. Is there anyone who's abstaining from voting on this matter? All right, thank you very much. So that we'll now move to vote on the recommendation 1A. So this is now a vote to advance recommendation 1A to the Climate Commission for its consideration. And the recommendation is as seen on screen. Again, sorry it's so long that I can't show it all at once. Any discussion before voting? Okay, hearing none. All in favor of advancing recommendation 1A to the Climate Commission, raise your hand. $13 in favor. Thank you. You can raise lower your hand. All opposed? Six opposed. Thank you. You can lower your hands. And any abstentions? All right, I see 1 abstaining. Thank you very much. All right, and just so everyone's aware, Kim and Mike certainly are. The norm is for recommendations that had a close vote to be presented to the Climate Commission with discussion about that vote. So Kim and Mike, as your co-chairs, will have the opportunity to explain the MWG's division on this recommendation. All right, we have otherwise approved all of recommendation 1. Parts B and C were approved last time. So that brings us to recommendation 2A. You might recall that the MWG settled 2B already last time. So this is just looking at 2A. And this is one of the areas where there was some work done on the core part of the recommendation by a group of MWG members. So thank you to Mark, Kim, Mike, and Ian for weighing in on this. Would any of you like to describe the streamlined amendment to 2A?
I mean, what we just did, if I can be helpful on this, is we just took out some of the detailed bureaucracy, if you want to use that term, would be involved in the reporting. It still would require the cost estimates to be provided by the contractors, but we took out all of the information about affidavits and some of the detail. And at least I'm supportive of this language as it's been amended.
And I'll add that it largely tracks Kim's original amendment. It retains that sort of core recommendation for HVAC contractors to provide estimates for heat pumps when people request estimates for air conditioners. I think the two main changes from my perspective are the sort of explicit recommendation for contractors to provide information about available incentives. Mike, I think on the last call, raised a valid concern that it might be too much to ask contractors to incorporate incentives into estimates because they're not necessarily in a good position to evaluate whether somebody qualifies, for instance, for a tax credit. But it's a different thing for them to provide information to the prospective customer to make that evaluation for him or herself. And the other sort of issue is, as Mike talked about, it sort of changes the bureaucratic approach. It's a little bit less prescriptive, and it carves out a role for labor as the agency in which the HVAC board is housed, in consultation with MEA, which sort of is best positioned to evaluate how we're doing with respect to incentives and whether additional incentives might be necessary.
Yeah, and I'll
Thank
just
you.
add, MEA, although there have been some recommendations to try to get around this, MEA is basically not a regulatory agency as opposed to a lot of agencies in the state. And so in this case, right, the Department of Labor and their occupational boards are the regulatory agency. And so we've tried to preserve that here, understanding that the Department of Labor may not be the expert on some of these areas. So that's why we tried to incorporate MEA, as in here to help. But it's labor that has that regulatory authority.
Thank you. And of course, this is already a seconded amendment, given the number of people who collaborated on it. Is there any further discussion? Is there any opposition to this amendment? Hearing no opposition, we will accept the language change. There are a few other suggestions, I think much of which was embraced by Kim, who was the original author of this, as friendly. I think these were some wording changes from you, Mark. So do you want to talk through any of these other pieces up top here?
Mark, that's directed at me.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think I regard these as sort of purely friendly amendments that just provide a little bit more context. I don't think they are substantive changes.
Thanks. And they've been effectively seconded by Kim. Is there any discussion on the green amendments that you see on your screen? Hearing no discussion, is there any opposition to the amendments that you see on your screen? Okay, hearing no opposition, we'll move to accept those. Thank you, Mark, for making the suggestions. Which I think brings us to a vote on this recommendation. All right, so fitting almost all of it on the recommendation to so it's under the banner of recommendation 2, which is transition from one-way air conditioners to heat pumps. We will come up with an appropriate heading for 2A itself based on the language of the recommendation, but moving to vote on this, and again reflecting the core changes here at the bottom regarding requiring heating and cooling contractor to provide their customers with cost estimates for heat pump installation when a customer requests an estimate for an air conditioner installation. Any discussion before moving to a vote? Hearing none, please raise your hand if you're voting in favor of advancing this recommendation to the Climate Commission. Thank you. I see 20 in favor. Are there any, I'm sorry, I'll wait for the hands to come down on that last vote. Sean and Ben, if you could put your hands down, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Are there any opposed? I see 0 opposed. Any abstentions? I see 0 abstentions. Thank you very much. That brings us to recommendation 4, the final one, although it has multiple parts. There was some work done between the last meeting and this one to amend 4A. I believe that this was worked on and agreed to by Garrett with input from MACO, the Maryland Association of Counties, Elliot, Mike, and Ian. So would any of you like to describe the amendments here in green?
I could start, I guess. There was a lot of back and forth on this. It basically preserves, in my opinion, the original recommendation that we need to improve the permitting process for solar power development. And it's not the only problem we got with getting solar development up to speed. But this is one of the areas where we can make progress. The original language would have required each county to designate sites for utility investment. And that's been taken out, and instead the language is more generic but directed at reducing the barriers, standardizing conditions, basically improving and speeding up the permitting processes, and then provides for Maryland DNR in conjunction with the other agencies to develop a statewide map giving preferential areas for utility scale solar development. A lot of this work was Garrett, so I really should turn over the the speaking podium to him and to Ian and Elliot to comment.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think we appreciate the time that everybody put in on this one. That first piece, I think as Mike said, last year we passed Brighter Tomorrow Act, which mostly focused on better financial incentives for smaller projects in preferred places like rooftop solar and ground mount, parking lot canopies and these kinds of things. Doing that, without spending state budget on it. And I think that's why we're focused here in this session. Let's focus on making it easier for bigger ground mount solar projects to be built in Maryland. And for the most part, we think we don't have to see an infusion of money into those projects in the form of incentives from state or local government. Ideally, just improving these permitting processes, getting some of the barriers out of the way will provide that kind of certainty that the solar developers are looking for. That'll make it a little bit easier for those projects to move forward. There's a piece here that we took out that, and ultimately the counties would prefer there being some form of compensation when projects are built in preservation or conservation areas to try to deter development in those places and steer it to more preferred places. We took that out to get to a compromise here. The hope with that second paragraph, this mapping that would happen at the state level, so it really is kind of a separate concept from the idea of let's standardize the conditions imposed on projects on solar statewide. This mapping concept, it's possible if individual counties or statewide programs say there's more solar for all money that comes around federally, and we have more of these kinds of opportunities to think about. If we have money to spend statewide to try to incentivize solar, where would we like to use that most? So the idea of there being more mapping to help all of us think about where the preferred kinds of places would be for solar. It's mostly private properties. So it's not really a plan of exactly where we're saying we will build it because we don't have control over private property. But it'll give us a better sense of where we would like things to go most, that in the future, if we have opportunities to apply future incentives, we'll be more prepared to do that in a way that's intelligent and aligns with our policy priorities at the time. And that's something that was talked about previously as a thing that all the counties would do. Most of the counties there's not a lot of budget and capacity to go and do all of this kind of analysis at that local level. It would be helpful if some of that analysis were happening statewide, kind of provided to counties for the counties to then do things with. But it is a separate idea. It's, than from the idea of standardizing the conditions around the project. So we think both of these things are good ideas and likely to be effective at actually unlocking some progress here on large solar development, which is what we're all after.
And because it's separate, as you're pointing out, from I'd suggest making this perhaps the new B, and we could re-letter from here.
I think that's a good idea.
It makes sense.
Okay. Jennifer, go ahead.
So I think that we don't even ask counties to necessarily have a plan and to put it in a central place for their climate work. Am I mistaken? I mean, should we add something here to ask the counties to, log in their plan and say how much it's costing, how much they're spending?
Are you asking about solar power in particular, or are you talking about climate
Actually,
change
just
generally?
writ large, my understanding from the controller's office is that these numbers and plans are very hard to find and are not centralized.
Yeah.
It is generally true. I mean, the counties, we have quite a diversity of capacity and commitment around climate across the counties in the state. And some of us, like here in Montgomery County, have pretty robust climate plans and, hundreds of pages long and perhaps far longer even than they need to be. And other places, there is no formal climate plan, though each and every county, obviously makes a lot of different decisions through various planning documents, whether they have a standalone climate plan or these issues come up in the course of land use plans and transportation plans and other kinds of planning documents. So we don't think there's a necessarily a one size fits all. Everyone must write a climate plan that includes exactly these elements and adds up costs in exactly this way. It's not necessarily practical for counties, but there has been a separate bill from the anything solar focused that was introduced. It wasn't introduced in 2024, but I want to say it was Delegate Fraser Hidalgo and Senator Kramer, I believe, worked on it 2 years ago and 3 years ago. There was a bill that sought to kind of direct all counties should have climate plans, and those climate plans should all include, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that bill didn't go anywhere during that time. I think there are some challenges with, how do you craft a bill like that would that would be practical, that would, that you could imagine some of these counties that have a lot less capacity to invest in this kind of planning to be able to meet the spirit of what we're doing there. That bill, effectively showed up as an unfunded mandate to counties, didn't offer help from the state. And there are a lot of ways in which more centralized analysis can be done, and some of this information can be provided to counties to potentially help them. But it got into a lot of detail, and a lot of the counties said, we're not able to look at any of these things because we don't have any capacity on this. So there was a lot of need for further kind of specific consideration of what would a bill that's trying to require / support counties generally to have climate plans, or to make sure climate shows up in their plans. What all should we be asking and helping them to look at, and how should that work? I would say that's an interesting idea that does need some kind of further discussion, and it didn't come back again this past year. We haven't been thinking about it recently, but if anyone ever wants to think more about that, I'm definitely happy to be part of that conversation. I wouldn't see it as part of this more solar focused bill personally. I feel like that's a separate kind of idea.
Garrett, is there additional conversation on the group amendment, which is presented here as 4A and B?
Maybe I'll just say, it's not only solar, right? All energy projects are very challenging to cite. We've got lots of controversy over offshore wind, controversy over transmission lines, other kinds of energy that people might want to think about will also be challenging. So I think what we tried to do is figure out a way to say, look, we want to incentivize and remove barriers to help us, meet our solar goals and our climate goals, and to help us get closer to, being more self-reliant and get to 100% clean energy. That's sort of what I was thinking. And I'm weary about potentially imposing additional costs. And that's why, we removed that one line that Garrett referred to. So I hope that this accomplishes that.
Thanks, Ian. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Is there any opposition to the group amendment? Okay, hearing no opposition, we'll move to accept the changes. Creating also in this acceptance a new B, which means that the old B and the other ones will be re-lettered after this would move on to the Climate Commission. So before voting on 4, there were a couple of other suggested amendments to. All right, going down to 4D. This one came in from DNR. So Elliot, do you want to discuss the changes for?
Sure. So we just added a line around establishing a timeline for utilities to complete review and cost estimates of interconnection. And that came from conversations with our power plant research program, and the fact that in some cases, the interconnection fees have come in much higher than were initially estimated, and projects weren't able to go forward because of those higher costs than the initial estimate. We did get some feedback from PSC that maybe 6 months is too fast, and that there is other ongoing processes to look at interconnection. So we could, perhaps modify that, but I do think it's, this is something that would help streamline the process.
Thanks, Elliot. Is there a second on Elliot's amendment to 4D? All right, I'll take that as a second from Sonia. Is there any discussion on 4D?
Actually, Mark, I wanted to make a comment if that's all right before we voted.
Yep, sorry. Yep, go ahead.
I just wanted to flag for folks that, we do have requirements for utilities through the COMAR regulations, and there's a really active PSC-led work group right now on all things interconnection that is working to develop new policies, the new Maryland cost allocation methodology that's going to be a more kind of equitable approach to interconnections and hopefully reduce some barriers to projects from a financial perspective is coming out of that. And so, I just am a little hesitant for this group to kind of jump ahead because, we really have a lot of the experts on that really technical topic working towards this exact goal of expediting and streamlining interconnections for large scale solar as kind of a top priority, but also considering storage and other DERs that are fast follow-ons with John Borkowski leading that group.
Got it. Thank you. And before I turn to Ben from PSC, is there anyone who's seconding the amendment on 4D from Elliot?
I'll second it just for discussion purposes so that we can hear from Ben.
Great. Thanks, Ian. All right, go ahead, Ben. Oh, Ben, we can't hear you right now.
Sorry about that. Thank you both. So all we were recommending in our correspondence, Mark and Elliot, is that we were saying for the part that says do it within 6 months to turn that over to the interconnection work group that Sonia was recommending and have them figure out the timeline. As she was saying, we got a pretty robust group of individuals there. We weren't sure where the 6 months originated from, so we just weren't sure if that was doable or not. But we do have a group of people that are obviously they basically proposing regulations every year that are modifying the interconnection standards that we have. So it's something that has to be spun up. The group's already. So this is something that we added to the plate. That was our recommended. And we just want to flag that we didn't know where the 6 months came from, so we thought we'd better go through the technical team first.
Okay. Well, if I can send that back to Elliot, are you able to elaborate on where 6 months came from or suggest any modifications to your amendment based on this input?
I mean, the 6 months came from Bob Sedzinski, the head of our PPRP program, as something that he thought was reasonable. But I do understand that there's this work group that's looking at that timeline. So, I mean, I'd be fine with modifying it, or I guess if we remove the 6 month, it's not really materially different than the rest of the content of the recommendation. Because it already says a timely manner. So maybe we could, I mean, I'm fine with pulling that recommendation. We could add in a timely manner as determined by the interconnection work group, but that's already an ongoing process.
Okay, so are you suggesting striking the amendment and keeping just the original language?
Yes.
All right. So then, with that amendment off the table, thank you. Then we'll go to item F. Brian, you'd suggested striking the line that would read, the state should require long-term contracts for renewable energy to support a portion of the standard offer service in the state.
Yeah, that's right. So
this this proposal didn't strike us as workable. So the collection of customers on standard offer service changes as customers move in and out of supply agreements with load servers. So the proportion of customers on standard offer service changes, but the cost of those long-term agreements is fixed. So there may be cost allocation issues that arise as a result of this type of measure, these long-term supply agreements. So that was really our main concern, that it doesn't really feel workable, and it's something that could lead to cost allocation issues.
Is there a second to the amendment?
I'll second the amendment. I do think, I mean, long time ago, I helped draft the statute that does the standard offer service, and I do know how complicated that is.
All right, we have a seconded amendment. Any discussion? Mark?
Yeah, I just wonder if Ben or anybody else could explain exactly how standard offer service procurement works right now. It's not something I work on. And just so, I mean, I don't know, I assume everybody's aware, but standard offer service is basically everyone who doesn't shop for their electricity, the electric utility buys it for them through a set of rules that are determined by legislation and regulation and the commission.
Mark, do you want me to talk to that? And I guess I can kind of explain how RPS works within that. That's what this, I think, is directed at.
That'd be great. Thanks, Ben.
Okay. So standard offer service, when we are developing the product, we are basically creating a product for customers who choose not to use a retail choice provider. The product is developed based off of 4 contracts that we sign over 2 years. So basically, we run 4 bids. A bunch of energy suppliers will bid in and say, "I promise to provide you this. I promise to serve this load for this price." And included within that bid is, we call it a full requirements bid. So therefore, as part of that pricing, they're saying, "I promise to comply with the RPS standard at this price as well," which could include either buying RECs that qualify under the RPS standard, having bilateral contracts. They themselves could choose to own RPS that gives them those RECs, but we're not dictating that they have those kinds of contracts. They just have to get the RECs to satisfy it, or pay the ACPs to satisfy it as well. So it's basically, they just have to satisfy the RPS standard as currently in law through that price when they give us that bid if we select them. And so that's currently how that is working. And then that's how that contract is then averaged with all the other selected contracts and will be in effect for 2 years. And as part of the supplier's agreement with of that contract, they're going to go out and satisfy the renewable portfolio standard for that set of load. So I'll stop there. If somebody needs me to explain something, I can try to do that.
Thanks, Ben. Mark, does that answer your question well enough?
Yeah, it does. I guess the one takeaway is that there won't necessarily be any long-term contracting for renewables. Ben, does the PSC have a position on this amendment?
No, I mean, I guess we didn't flag anything on our side that we were going to raise as a implementation concern. I mean, this would modify how SOS works if you do not strike it. I'm not saying that it's good policy one way or the other, which way you go. But if you leave F in, we will have to modify how SOS works. So we hadn't taken a policy position on this one. But I think we would have to find a way to make bilateral contracting with renewables function within our SOS procurement processes. If we did that.
If I can just make one comment, Mark, based upon my limited knowledge of this. Obviously, anytime you put a restriction on the bids for the auction, it can have the effect of raising the cost of standard offer service, right? the more hurdles that a bidder has to jump through, such as finding a long-term contract, would have some potential impact on the bidding price.
Yeah, and that was on my mind as well. I mean, I think there's maybe a balance to be struck here. On the one hand, you're talking about the possibility, maybe probability of higher SOS costs. And on the other hand, this mechanism probably would result in more solar projects. So I guess question for Brian. I mean, OPC would, I don't think I think we're sympathetic to your striking. It also seems there are unanswered questions. Would you be open to modifying so that this said, for instance, the state should consider requiring, so that it stops short of an actual recommendation to require?
I think that's okay. I mean, I think the implementation would be very tricky to avoid this, sort of cost shifting potential that I mentioned. So if it's considered as part of an inquiry into what sort of program design would be feasible, then I think that's acceptable.
Okay, we'll continue discussion on this modified amendment. State should consider requiring long-term contracts for renewable energy. Tom.
Mark, I'm just raising my hand to make a comment on G once we've finished here.
Oh, got it. Okay. Noted. Thanks. Sonia, do you have a comment on F?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to ask, between you, Brian and Ben, I think of one of the big lessons from last year, right, was that we want to come forth with the recommendations that matter, like the impactful ones. So given that this sounds really complicated for a variety of reasons, like, do you guys think if we got the structure right, would this really move the needle on accelerating development? Or are there some of the other recommendations here that could have the same type of impact, but perhaps not get into like market redesign? It's sort of a prioritization question, I guess.
Yeah. This would be a tool, I guess, to help the state get closer to its renewable standards. I think there is a debate around if the current incentive structure in general is going to bring renewables into the state with the declining ACP curve that is in effect. So long-term, like developers, my understanding is they always love it if somebody's willing to sign a contract that's going to say, I will guarantee you for 5 to 15 years payment. And that's probably going to help get steel into ground. Whether that should be done through the SOS process or some other process, I think it may make, if you with what you're stating, it might make more sense instead of say definitively it should be an SOS. Should we be considering that the entities are doing something that looks more like a long-term contract instead of the current process? Because what you're doing here, I guess, well, before you jump, I think the question is, does the state want to basically have somebody enter into long-term contracts to start putting steel on the ground? So SOS could be a tool to do that, but it probably would make more sense to say, let's look at that policy in general, instead of stating it should be done through the current procurement mechanisms. But we'd have to look at how that all works in general. That stated, I think the real policy question for everyone on this call is currently the risk of something not materializing is really on the developers, and I would say the risk to the state is the ACP curve. So that's what they've currently put in statute as if the juice isn't worth the squeeze, then I just pay the alternative compliance payments. Going into long-term contracting, if something doesn't work out or prices got better in the future, that is our downward risk in terms of procurement. So this is now getting into, you're bringing the risk back onto the ratepayer in terms of guaranteeing a longer term contract. That's not bad thing per se. That's just something to be aware of what would come out of this maybe. And so you're just, it's thinking, I think at the core of this is I guess a tool when you're talking about contracting through SOS. I think the policy question you all maybe should be thinking about is, do you want to use long-term contracts instead of the ACP curve, or in conjunction with the ACP curve to get to where you want to go? If that helps Sonia and maybe helps reframe the discussion. So.
Thanks.
There's another option here if we're in consideration land, which is that we could consider putting this on the MWG's agenda for next year to talk more about before suggesting the state should consider this.
I would support that because this is a potentially very complex policy issue that I think would really require some further consideration.
Ian, did you have a comment on?
Just say this has been an idea that's been before the legislature for many years. Obviously, it's never passed. I would say we should probably just table it and maybe look at it, let's see what happens during session and the beginning of the year. And, I think some of these RPS measures like Ben was talking about are, subject to conversation and may get altered this session. I think that seems to be, so it might be good to hold on this one and sort of see what happens, since we haven't really talked about it at all during the year as well. So.
Yeah, I'd support that as well.
Okay, so what I'm then hearing is that this would be tabled for further MWG discussion next year, which would essentially remove it from the list of recommendations this year that would be advancing to the Climate Commission. Is there any objection to that? Okay, hearing no objection, we will effectively strike it for now and put it on the MWG's work plan. Tom, you mentioned having a comment on G, so go ahead.
So quickly, I look, when I look at a lot of the recommendations here, they put pragmatism, readiness, other kinds of, I think, constructive considerations into play for solar, and I want to endorse them and vote for the package. G and J are making recommendations on what should be in the next building and energy code. I'm not sure what we're being asked to endorse. There are, I guess, multiple versions of draft 2024 IEC. And our experience with last year's bill on rooftop and canopy solar was a relatively good one, but its application is limited. And the same has been true on legislation where we've supported different concepts on EV infrastructure. But our larger concern is that the same kind of pragmatism that's in these other concepts may not be read into the language on G and J, and they're really not central to the bigger goals, at least the way I read the other recommendations. I don't want it to be a hang up for the other more important ideas here, but for me, I either need to read them very broadly in terms of discretion on the part of the codes administration, or allow these building code questions to be handled in a different venue than this set of recommendations.
Thanks, Tom. I'm trying to pull up. So I just pulled up the 2022 Commission Annual Report. That you all might recall the starting point for all of these solar recommendations was to advance what the Climate Commission had endorsed in its 2022 report. And you know, these amendments are modifying the commission's 2022 recommendations. So I think what we have is that one of those, G, is in the 2022 Commission Annual Report. The Building Codes Administration should adopt solar related provisions in the draft 2024 International Energy Conservation Code. I think the other one, let me go back to the screen here, was a new recommendation, new construction, both residential and commercial code should be updated, yada, yada. And that one I think was not already supported by the Climate Commission. I'm saying all this to mostly to catch my own brain up to where we are, and for everyone's just context on this discussion.
So I guess my concern is sort of indiscriminately putting a recommendation in there that this infrastructure be installed, whether there's really much prospect of interconnection or not. And as the BEPS is proposed, there's no credit for on-site power generation, solar or otherwise. So it's a, you know, if it's interpreted broadly as a, you know, they should look at it and adopt what is kind of pragmatic, like some of these other approaches to where we're putting solar. Otherwise, I think they're a bit out of context with the other utility scale and larger kinds of recommendations.
Are you suggesting that this one, like the last one, be tabled for discussion? Is that the idea?
I would prefer that, but I support a lot of these other things, and I don't want it to be a tripwire for that.
Gotcha. Just trying to understand what your proposal is.
Okay, so I'm hearing the proposal is to table G and J for further discussion at the MWG next year. Let me just quickly ask if there's a second on tabling G and J before we go to further discussion.
This is Bob Wright. I second it.
Thank you, Bob. All right, discussion on tabling G and J. I see a hand up from Commission Member David Spennick. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Not a voting member on the MWG, but on the full commission, so I won't speak to the second and the decision at hand on that too specifically, but I do believe that the 2024 IECC is now finalized. So I think that some language in that one would need to be adjusted. I believe there are solar related appendices to the IECC that could be adopted, and I believe that basically my understanding is, and I can check with our codes staff on our buildings team, that the clock is now ticking for Maryland because of our statutes to start the adoption process for the 2024 IECC, and we could be adopting the additional provisions associated with that code. So again, if the MWG would like, I'd be happy to get some additional information around this one, but I just want to put that out there. It is no longer in draft form.
Okay, thanks. And if any version of this were to advance, we still have some opportunity in the process to make clarifying or fact-finding edits to these. Jennifer.
Like Dave, I'm not a voting member of this group, but I am a commissioner, and I would love to see these make it to the commission for a full discussion. I think they're productive and helpful.
Thank you. Any further discussion on tabling G and J? Garrett.
I'd prefer we don't table them. I think I interpret them both pretty broadly, and I think that this is the right time to be flagging that we would like, when the state does its state layering on top of the 2024 IECC, we should be looking at both of these things. To me, there's a benefit that they are written in such a high level general way that I don't look at them as sort of absolute language where there must be no exceptions to these things and all that. I feel like it's important that we send the policy signal to the folks who work on the building code at the state level. We should be trying to incorporate these kinds of things into the code. Don't just do nothing on this. Like, please do try. And, you know, we'll live with them not imposing it on all buildings in all ways, and that's fine. But I don't think we need to do. I don't want to have to do the detailed thinking on that. I just want to be telling them, like, please make this a focus as you are working on building code, and hope that they do something. So I would rather leave these in personally.
Thanks, Garrett. Mark?
Yeah, just in the interest of time, I agree with Jennifer and Garrett. Appreciate Tom's concerns, but don't think these should be tabled.
Any further discussion before voting to table or keep G and J in these recommendations? Ian?
I just say, obviously, if this recommendation were to move forward to the Climate Commission, although the meeting is Monday, but there would be some additional time to gather some more information on some of the this. That's and I think there's actually be 2 commission meetings, and maybe somebody could move to have that be considered at the second meeting, just to provide additional time. I recognize that not everybody here is on the full commission, but it does provide that opportunity to gather more information before making a final decision for the year.
Yeah, and a scheduling note, the commission does meet Monday. The commission will be discussing recommendations that were approved prior to today. So any recommendations that would be advanced from the MWG to the commission will be heard at a meeting in mid-October and not the one on Monday. Sonia.
I know we're getting real short on time here. Is there a compromise in this that could grab the ones that are code related and kind of make them their own thing? I mean, process and tools are really different than should require codes. And so you wouldn't have to table them necessarily, but they'd be kind of evaluated and recommended on their own merits that way.
Tom?
I raised my hand to offer something as an alternative. I think we really I don't know what's being referred to as in the draft. So striking the word draft in G would be helpful, I think. I'll just interpret J broadly and let this process move on, but taking the draft out of G, I think was helpful. So I propose striking the word draft in item G.
Is that an alternative to tabling, Tom? I just want to make sure.
Yes, as an alternative to tabling. I read the room on the tabling question.
Okay. Is there any opposition to striking draft from G? All right, hearing none, we will accept that strike. And on the issue of J, did I hear you say, Tom, that you're willing to interpret this broadly and remove the?
Look, I think these questions are on the table already. I think I'm going to interpret it broadly, and we'll see what the code process.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I think that brings us to. Did I forget? Okay. Apologies because I did not write down who submitted this one. Is this from you, Elliot?
That's for me, yeah. So this again comes from conversations with PPRP. And as I understand it, SREX in Maryland, their formula is set so they decline, the price declines over time. This simply says, I think just kind of expands on the existing content of the recommendation that we should stabilize the SREC prices relative to other PJM states that are set to either be steady or even increase over time.
Thank you. Is there a second?
This is Garrett. I don't know if I want to second it. I have a question is, how does it actually, I don't know enough about this. What do we do to stabilize SREC prices relative to other PJM states? Maybe someone can explain that a bit more.
Maybe PSC can help me out with that, or others that are more familiar with that process.
That actually is my concern with this is I can think of several different ways to do it, and so it's right. I mean, you could simply set a minimum SREC price. You could change the declining amount that it's in there. Some of them make some sense. Some of them make less sense, and it's a generic description.
Yeah, it is open-ended.
Can I just jump in here, Mark? The most straightforward way is to address the alternative compliance payments that are in the law, and that is essentially a minimum SREC price, because if it gets, if the SREC or actually it's a maximum, right? So if the SREC price hits the ACP, which is what's been happening, then rather than purchasing RECs, the energy suppliers are paying the ACP. So right now, ACP is going down. It's cheaper in Maryland than in other states, and therefore it's destabilizing the SREC market. But it's also should be understood that if you raise the ACP, it does have a ratepayer impact, and that's one of the reasons why the legislature, to this point, has declined to do so.
Before we continue discussion, is there a second on the amendment to H? And then note that we're 4 minutes from 1. So Kim and Mike, you'll need to decide quickly how we advance these remaining issues. Can someone voice if they're seconding?
I'll second it.
H, the amendment to H.
Yeah,
okay, thanks. Okay, so we can continue conversation, but quick pause to hear from the co-chairs. How would you like to manage the remaining time of the meeting?
We have to finish these amendments, and we've got to finish voting. So I would suggest we quickly call a vote on this one, and on the next couple, we try to reduce comments as much as possible to try to speed things along.
And maybe put out there if people can stay on another 10 or 15 minutes. So.
Agreed.
Okay, we will move expeditiously and hopefully not too far past 1 o'clock. Is there further discussion then on the amendment to H? Brian.
No, we're short on time here, so I'll just say quickly that I think that among the proposals here related to solar, this is likely to be the most impactful in terms of helping to stimulate further solar development in the state, notwithstanding the comment that Ian made that there will be ratepayer impacts, which is something that the legislature will have to deal with. But this is a really important point and should not be misunderstood.
Brian, further discussion? Hearing none, is there opposition to accepting the amendment to H?
Yeah, I think I have to call for a vote on this because I just don't know what's involved, and the potential impact to ratepayers could be very, very large depending upon what is done.
Then calling the vote. Please use your hand raise feature to indicate if you accept the amendment in green to item H on the screen. Thank you. That's 12 in favor. Unless our attendance have changed, I think that will carry the vote. But if you put those hands down, we'll do a quick no vote. Just to including this, please put your hand up.
Oh, excuse me, Mark, could you repeat, right now it's abstentions or no?
These are no votes for the amendment to H.
Thank you.
Okay, so the amendment is included. H. We will go to item I. Elliot.
Just really quickly on PPRP didn't feel like they had the data necessary to report on the amount of new solar by year. I know that ESC also feels like they don't have the data. But yeah, that's where the amendment came from.
Thanks. Let me ask for if there's a quick second to the amendment to I, and then we'll start discussion.
I'll second.
Thank you very much. Ben.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think we were trying to resolve this by email beforehand, but yeah, we couldn't be the primary on this. If there's data we are sitting on that would be helpful, we are certainly we were happy to be on there, like in conjunction with. We can be one of those in conjunction with parties. But we have access to the GAT system, which is where we track renewable, or where we track the RECs that are developed or created for the state. But I think where that recommendation is going had a lot to do with location-based information, so GIS mapping and all that good jazz, and that's stuff we don't have access to. So the idea is we want to know how many RECs are produced and where they're coming, like which facilities they're coming from. We have access to that, and we provide it every year in our annual RPS report. If you're looking for kind of a locational assessment and where it's best to strategically place things going forward, I think that's where so the back half of that recommendation was why we were like, we don't think we're the appropriate agency for this. We're happy to work with PPRP if they want to be the lead agency and give them the data they need, or MEA. But yeah, that's just where we were coming from. Thanks.
Got it. Thanks. Ian.
I just don't think MEA has that information either. So I would oppose having MEA. I would, if nobody has it, we might not be ready for this recommendation. That would be my suggestion, because I'll vote against it. And if MEA is there, because we just don't have the ability to do that. We don't have any way of knowing that information.
Jennifer?
Perhaps we should recommend that it should be collected by somebody.
Yeah, could we change the recommendation to just say that these three should get together and figure out how this could work in the future?
I mean, what we know is what the PSC has already, right? Like Ben was just describing. So we have we know how much solar production there is because of as long as they're registered in the rec market. So we already have that. It's the detail about prime farmland and that kind of stuff, the locational information that nobody has and nobody really has the ability to collect, as far as I know. I mean, utilities have the interconnection agreements. Maybe that, but I think we would need to have further conversation to figure out how that might work.
Yeah, I think you could fold elements of this into the mapping exercise in part 1, where we're identifying the priority areas. But I think I would recommend just striking this completely for now, and then again, tabling it for further consideration between the agencies.
Okay, so Elliot, as the author of the amendment, is suggesting changing the amendment to, oh, that was a little abrupt, sorry, to strike I. Further discussion on removing I from the recommendations, Mark?
I do believe that it's a good idea to strike it right now, but not to delete it from our thoughts, and to keep it definitely for further discussion.
Sorry, yeah, I oversimplified things. So not removing for now, and did I hear correctly, Elliot, making it a topic for further discussion at the MWG?
Yeah, let's table it.
Okay, is there any objection to tabling and putting on the MWG's work plan? All right, I hear no objection to that, so we'll table item I, which brings us to the final one. Elliot, in addition to this list of solar recommendations, item L.
So this is pretty similar to the second part of item A, I guess B now, where that priority areas, but the novel part of this recommendation is that it suggests so I think this is maybe not the newest version, Mark. We had a revised version that Garrett and I had come up with that
Wasn't this just replaced by B?
yeah,
I was
I
thinking
think
we were just deleting this altogether and B was the new version of it.
that was the intention, yeah, now that I look at it more closely. So let's just strike that last one because yeah, we did incorporate elements of it into B. Yeah.
Stick to everyone's ears at 6 minutes past the end of the meeting. Okay, so then we have a fully amended recommendation 4. I'll just quickly review. You accepted changes to A, you created a new B. We'll re-letter the following letters. Items F and I will be tabled for the MWG to discuss further. So we can move 4 in its entirety to a vote. So please use the hand raise feature to accept recommendation amended and advance that to the Climate Commission. Great. Thank you. We've got 17 in favor. And as the hands come down, Ben, if you could put your hand down, Ben Hobbs. Thank you. Any opposed? Seeing 0 opposed. Any abstentions? Seeing 0 abstentions. Item 4 as amended will be advanced to the Climate Commission. I believe that concludes the work of the MWG for the day. Kim, Mike, anything to add?
No, I think that's fine. I do think we need to start turning our attention now to what we're going to do next year. We'll be back doing that. But thanks everybody for bearing in here and going through all of these very complex issues.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I think there's a lot to be proud of in this work. So appreciate everybody's efforts. And are we canceling the October 23rd meeting?
I think that we can. Let's see, Mike, if you want to agree to that right now, we can pull that down.
I think that's a good idea.
All righty. Well, you all just got 2 hours of October back, so there you go. And as noted, the Climate Commission has a meeting on Monday to begin discussing the recommendations that it had already received from the working groups. There will be another meeting in mid-October when these recommendations that were heard today will likely be on the docket. Thank you very much and enjoy your weekend, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.